All right, well, welcome everyone. I believe my audio is working just fine this morning, hopefully. Hopefully you're somewhere, sounds like Eastern Nebraska is getting due for some rain today. So welcome to our last installment of Land Management Quarterly. This is a fourth edition for the 2024 year. Today I'm being joined by Anastasia Meyer and our media support specialist, Ryan Evans, to help deliver this session. Today's presentation will be about 1 hour long. I think many of you that are joining us today have joined in on these presentations in the past. I see some familiar names on here, so welcome everyone. And what we'll do, we'll go ahead and get our first slide going. My name is Jim Jansen. Anastasia Meyer is on the right of this slide. Anastasia is the counterpart for our land management program here in the greater eastern part of Nebraska, and together we'll be presenting on different topics related to land management today. Also, had a note, our staff member asked me to drop this in here. In the past, we've done sponsorship for Land Management Quarterly. If there's anyone that'd be interested in sponsoring our webinars, as part of the sponsorship, we feature your business at least twice during the presentation, and you can prepare a slide or we can prepare one for you. And we'll list the contact information, name of the business, and the nature of the service that you folks might provide throughout Nebraska. Our outline for today's presentation, we have basically three sections. The first section today, we're going to be highlighting some of the 2024 county level cash rent survey estimates from the USDA. I'll also be taking a look at the ARC and PLC farm program payments. Where did those come out? Where might they be headed for next year? Anastasia will be taking a look again at landlord-tenant communication, quote unquote, closing out the lease. What does that mean? Considerations for the 2025 year. And then we'll have some questions that have been submitted. We remind everyone that if you have a question you'd like addressed in the future, please submit it on the Land Management Quarterly website, and we'd be more than happy to prepare some slides in advance of our presentation. So first thing, I want to point out the USDA 2024 county level cash rent. These estimates are published by the USDA, and I will also point out that if you'd like a copy of these numbers, either go and find the slides that will be posted within the next 24 to 48 hours on the Land Management Quarterly website, or do some searching around online, and you're going to be looking for the USDA-National Agricultural Statistics Service Nebraska Cash Rent Survey results. So that's what you need to be looking for. A little background on their survey. The USDA has a division called NASS. NASS stands for the National Agricultural Statistics Service. Their regional plains office for the Northern Great Plains, I believe that's the division. It covers Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota, is actually based in O Street in Lincoln. It's a big building on O Street that takes up almost an entire city block. And some of the work that the statisticians do there, they do a survey, and conduct a survey, and their survey is conducted a little bit later in the year than what the University of Nebraska does, and that's fine. But in recent years, they've been publishing results. And if you would like to find this information, there's this great big link right here. And if you go to this, I would strongly suggest saving it to your favorites so you can find it again in the future. And on the next three slides, we'll highlight the cash rent maps. All right, so the first one we have up here is for dryland cropland or non-irrigated cropland in Nebraska. I'll point out a few things. One, if you are in an area, an example out in the Sandhills, there's not a lot of grazing land out in these counties. With that being said, the average rate reported, they don't have enough estimates reported that they could provide confidentiality. So that's why some of these counties are in white. And also there are other areas maybe are heavily irrigated, or maybe there's areas where you didn't get enough responses back. So once again, if you'd like to know this information in the future, you got to respond to the survey. General things you might pick up on. Eastern Nebraska tends to have higher cash rental rates than what Western Nebraska does. I would surmise it might be based on rainfall and length of growing season and type of soil. And inside of each region, hopefully you can kind of see, especially here in eastern Nebraska, for example, the University of Nebraska publishes regional cash rental rates. These county level cash rents, it seems to me that the higher third the cash rents tend to be in the eastern part relative to the western part of each region. And that probably gets tied back to consistency and rainfall. That's a big thing. And you can see it here in the southeast. The closer you get to Iowa or the Missouri River, you tend to have higher cash rents here versus, let's say, in Nuckolls, Thayer, or Fillmore County, for example. So this is for the 2024 annual cash rental rate per acre for dryland cropland in Nebraska. Now, the next map we have here, and I notice compared to 2023, there's a fair number more counties that are in white here. That means there weren't enough people to respond to the survey. But once again, you can hopefully gain some insight and see how cash rental rates vary around in each region. The USDA does not segregate the center pivot versus the gravity or flood irrigated rates. And you'll notice an example, I'm just going to pick on, let's say, Adams County. I'm just making this up, but let's say in Adams County, a third of the ground is flood irrigated compared to center pivot. Well, the average that they come up with right here is going to be a weighted average that reflects both the center pivot as well as the flood or the gravity irrigated rates. So that's the breakdown that we have here across the state of Nebraska. We have a lot of different cash rental rates being reported, and that's tied to, once again, rainfall. Yes, I know this is irrigated, but in extreme western Nebraska versus Washington County, the rainfall is considerably different. And also length of growing season, soil type. And I believe the USDA rates assume that the landlord owns the entire irrigation system. That would include the pivot, the pump, and the power unit. If the tenant provides one of those components, you might discount that cash rent to reflect the fact that the landlord is not always the one providing all of those things. So if the tenant provides the pivot, for example, the cash rental rate that's going to be reported, the landlord may not be carrying the insurance on that pivot structure if the tenant is the one that owns it. So all the cash rental rates for irrigated cropland is just not a return on the land, but also a return on the improvements and the upkeep and the things associated with them. Okay. Grazing land, it's good to see there are quite a few responses in the greater western half of the state here. And what you see here is we have a breakdown by county. The breakdown by county gives us an indication on how the cash rents, once again, vary around in some of these different regions. What I've noticed is that we tend to see higher cash rents in the eastern part of each region relative to the western. So an example, in the northeast, Burke County's at 7150, but Boone County's at 4550. Why is that? Well, rainfall, the type of geography, how many acres does it take for one cow-calf pair? And I believe these cash rental rates are typically for the summer grazing period, typically about 5 months. If you're somewhere in the state of Nebraska where you might do off-season grazing, say later in the fall, earlier in the spring, the cash rental rates that you have reported here are going to reflect the typical summer grazing season. So if you have, for example, sub-irrigated meadows that you cut for hay and then you graze it, you would have to plan accordingly for that when you're setting that cash rental. Let's talk a little bit about the USDA farm program payments. The USDA on the commodity provisions related to corn, soybeans, wheat, things of that nature, many of us are concerned about the ARKANS PLC program. And actually, as part of our Thursday webinar series, if you didn't have a chance to watch this, Brad Lubin always does a nice job in partnership with University of Missouri. They do a lot of different outlooks and forecast estimates. And I pulled about, I believe it was 4 slides from one presentation and maybe 2 from another one. And you can go back and watch the entire recording, but I just want to highlight a few things that we might be thinking about. One thing to be keeping in mind, what we experienced right now, we have come off a period of time where we had exceptional net farm income, and things have started to subside since then. Okay? Uh, Agriculture is a very cyclical thing. What happened about 10 years ago? Now, I hope we don't see our net farm income drop quite that much. But anytime we have extremes in the market, drought, run up in commodity prices for whatever reason, we start setting records or we get much higher than we had expected, but then things subside a little bit. So in this slide right here, we have the net farm income, which is this tattered blue shading in the bar. And then we have the government program payments. So different types of disaster assistance, commodity safety nets, things of that nature are in green here. And what do you notice? Well, when it comes to it, we are down on our income. So when we are talking about 2025 cash rents, we need to be talking about a cash rent that's not being based on that extreme high, but things, especially on the crop side, appear to be a little bit more challenging, a little bit tougher. So we need to have an honest conversation about where things are occurring. And related to where things are occurring right now, this is since 1970 to forecasting it all the way out to the end of this decade. But 2024, so 2020 is right here, so 21, 22, 23. It looks to me, based on this slide, livestock prices have set pretty high prices right now. But on the flip side of that, crop prices, corn, soybeans, wheat, common things that we graze across the state have subsided some. So yes, it is a mixed bag. Net farm income has subsided some, especially on the crop side. It's a little bit steadier to slightly higher on the livestock side. And what are some of the other things that we're facing? Well, some of the other things that we're facing if you're in the business of raising crops are shown on this slide right here, or raising livestock. You have farm input expenses, other expenses. Interest rates are definitely a lot higher than they've been. You maybe don't see it quite as high on here, but I can tell you if you're someone that's operating on a line of credit, they are definitely much higher than what they've been. Manufactured input expenses, maybe different types of fertilizers, especially with parts and repairs on agricultural equipment, much higher than it's been. Now, I don't know if they'll necessarily come back to where they have been, but when incomes rise, sometimes we see that expenses rise as well, and there might be a little bit of a ratcheting effect where we don't see them come down in as fast or as in proportion to what we see when we see crop revenue decline. So keep that in mind. So the big three on the crop side, especially seed, fertilizer, chemicals. Where are those headed? Do you have a tenant or an operator that's prepaying some of those expenses? I know there's a lot of conversations going on right now on at least pricing some of these things or putting down down payment on a portion of them. You don't have to have a tenant bring out their pocketbook to show the landlord how much money they got in their bank account. But can you talk in simple terms? The price of seed was up per acre compared to last year, was fertilizer, chemicals. There's been opportunities to price some of those. I think fertilizer and chemicals, especially in fertilizer, prices have gotten a little bit closer to the 5-year average where they've been. But seed and different types of chemicals, there's many different places where you can find these resources. Just have a frank conversation about where are they coming from and what does that all entail. A few other things I wanted to point out. When we talked about those government disaster payments, so let me slip back here for a second. That little green portion on this bar right here, if you kind of notice this, I think 2024, if I'm not mistaken, right here, it's right here is where the estimate is. What does that green bar all compose of related to government program payments? Well, over the years, these programs have been different in nature. This big pink bar right here, that was due to the advent of COVID and some of the disruptions in that trade and some of the things surrounding that. Supplemental disaster payments, years during drought. That might be some of those specialty payments you see getting made. But it looks to us, based on some of these payments right now are curtailing to a degree compared to what they had been. They've come up a little bit here this year, maybe, but we're not getting payments at the size or scale of what we maybe have had in some of the different years going back here. And let's talk a little bit about ARC and PLC. Brad Lubin's presentation, I bet he gets a little bit more deeper into this than what we have time for. ARC stands for Agricultural Risk Coverage. With the ARC program, the most common option many folks tend to take comes with the county level trigger. Price loss coverage is a national price safety. PLC is not directly concerned about what is growing on the field. PLC is concerned about what is in the historic, what they call the base acres associated with the property. It's your historic set of information, what has historically been raised on that property and historically what has it yield. And some of those numbers aren't nearly as up to date in terms of what your crop insurance APH and practices might be. With each of these programs, ARC is an area-wide revenue safety net. So with ARC, it is not tied just to your farm, it's tied to the county level yield and using a national price. PLC is just concerned about a national price. So on the left here, we start with the PLC price guarantee. We see this right here, $8.40 for beans, $3.70 for corn. And then if you just for a second held, remember with the ARC program, the program starts paying at 86%. So let's say you produced exactly where the county's historic yield would be. The guarantee would be a little bit lower than relative to PLC, but you have to keep in mind with ARC, you also can tie in your county into that risk pool. So on the far right-hand side here, if you were just focusing on the price portion of the safety net, how much would things have to decline to trigger the program? Well, if the marketing year average price rate here, you can see it is clearly higher for our major program crops that we have insured here. So there was essentially no PLC payments made in the fall of 2024 for the 2023 season. There had been a few counties that I picked up on that received not huge, but some ARC program safety net payments for dryland cropping practices. And I would surmise it was probably in counties that had a significant shortfall on dryland cropping practices. So extreme drought. So this is the take home. We're not seeing substantial payments in the 2023 crop that gets paid at the end of the fiscal year, which is late September, early October of this past month or two. Now for 2024, remember with these programs, ARC or PLC, these payments, if we would receive any disaster assistance payments made, they are made either in late September or early October of 2025. Okay, so it's almost a year out from now still. And with the PLC, there's a rule inside of there, and we don't have to get into the details of it, but it's a minimum of $3.70 and $8.40 for corn and soybeans, or they can use this Olympic rolling average and do some math behind that. Just know the guarantees are up a little bit more for the PLC program. Okay, we see these right here. And we have the ARC program once again, and that rolling revenue guarantee where we're using Olympic average price and Olympic average yield. We're starting to work in some of these higher prices that we had a few years prior, and that's why we're seeing the guarantees go up. Now, this is just a complete price projection, and this price average here is through the fall of 2025. So there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding this at this point. In the red box to the far right here, what do you notice? Well, how much the prices would have to drop. We're quote unquote almost at the money when it comes to PLC, when we're looking at corn, soybeans, and wheat, a little bit further off on soybeans. But once again, very similar with the projections on ARC relative to that. Remember, ARC is a county level revenue guarantee, so you have to also incorporate that Olympic average yield, and then you have to see what it actually yields and what the actually county revenue was. But once again, you have a few of them that are projected right now. Might be making some payments on corn and grain sorghum. Couple this with maybe a slightly dry year or something to that effect. You know what? Maybe there would be some payments made. So we are very close right now. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding crop prices, yields for 25, but there may be some degree of disaster assistance that could come possibly in the future if prices currently where they're at continue to prevail, especially under ARC if your county crop yield would be down. So, okay. All right, so that brings us to the end of the first third of our presentation. We're going to have Anastasia Meyer get started, and I'll just mute myself, and she's going to go ahead and hit her camera on here in a second. And okay.
Okay. Thanks guys for joining us today. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, just wanted to make sure. So crops are mostly out for the majority of the state. So what should tenants and landlords be talking about right now? Well, now's a great time to get out into the field and take a walk out of there. Do you have any erosion issues? Now's a great time to be seeing it. We are getting some rain here in eastern Nebraska. I'm in Lincoln today, and we're actually getting a fair amount of rain. So if there's any erosion control issues, we're probably going to be seeing that after the last couple of weeks that we've had in this part of the state. So go out there, see if you have any ditches. Are they small ditches that your tenant can fix with a disc, or are they going to need some specialty large equipment to come in and cover it? Talk about it. A lot of times tenants will take care of the light disking, but I do want to point out and remind people that any large erosion control issues should be on the landowner to cover that cost. With that being said, a lot of tenant is getting that specialty equipment. So maybe it's something that you talk about paying them a portion and offering reduced rent or something like that. Go out there and see if you're having any weed control issues. Henbit right now is really germinating, it's popping up. Do you guys need to spray in the fall? Or do you guys need to spray in the spring? Depending on where you live in the state and if you have any cultivation or disking or if you spray, now's a good time to be checking out what your field is looking like, how the tenant management practices matches up with your own goals for your farm. And if they don't, talk to them about it. We always want to preach good communication between a tenant and landowner. We don't want disputes to happen due to the lack of communication among the two. So crops are out, but do you know how your field did? Well, in a crop share arrangement, you probably do. But if it's a cash lease arrangement, first question is, do you care to know about it? How yield information is going to go is based off of your guys' relationship. If you guys have a verbal lease and the tenant does not want to share their yield information, they don't have to share it because it's a verbal lease. But for cash leases, if you want that information, you need to put it in a contract. You need to have that lease in writing, and you need to have that in the lease provision that you want to have it in the contract. The yield data monitor from the combine for cash leases, again, if you want it, you need to specify it in that lease. Crop share leases, you know, that's kind of the gray area. They should be willing to share that information with you. You can ask for it, but depending on what your contract says, especially cash leases, they don't have to share. Crop leases, hopefully you guys have a good communication that they are willing to share that. So that, if you want to compare it based off of what maybe the elevator receipts have versus your yield monitor. But I do also want to urge a caution that just because a yield monitor says that, remember that it might not be accurate. Did the farmer take the time to calibrate those yield monitors, or are they just going with it and getting a rough idea of, hey, this area needs some attention, it's a low yield. So maybe look at the yield maps as, hey, this part of the field is doing great, but there's something going on here. What was that issue? Whether it had whether it had a disease in this field, or maybe it has some water issues that it's not draining correctly. But not to take that yield map number too seriously, because who knows if they calibrated or not. So the moral of the story is you can ask for it, but unless it's in writing, they don't have to share it. Most tenants are willing to share that information because they want to keep farming it the next year. So some things to think about there. What about corn stalks? We're starting to see fences go up around fields, and cattle are getting turned out. Well, we often get asked, who gets to use the corn stalks? Well, in a cash lease, those corn stalks are the tenant's ownership. So they have the right to sublease it. They have the right to graze it themselves. Do you need to charge rent for the corn stalks? Well, my typical rule of thumb is if it's the tenant's corn stalks, even in a cash share, if they are going out there and they are putting the fence out, maybe they're hauling water, it's their stocks, you have that relationship with them, maybe you just let them have it, because depending on what area of the state you are in, maybe you need to get rid of that extra trash in the field, and then it's breaking down, you're getting the manure benefits in there. Any concerns is maybe, in a crop share arrangement, if they go and bale them, well, then you might limit the amount of times that they can go in and bale it and how much they can bale. You don't want to remove all the residue off the field completely, simply because you're going to have some wind erosion control, maybe some water erosion, but not to mention the fact that your cost for nutrients, because those stalks are not breaking down into the soil, might be higher too. So consider limiting the baling of the corn stalks maybe once every few years, or maybe you say that 75% of the stalks can be baled. Again, depending on where you are in the state and what your yields are, is going to be depending on how much stover is actually left out into the field. But whether you charge or not, that's going to be up to you. Corn stalks graze rent is kind of all over the board based off of where you are and if you have to haul water or not. But my general rule of thumb is if it's a tenant cows going out there, let them have it. Now, if they're subleasing it, maybe then you get a portion of it, especially if you're a crop share. What about manure application? I talked a little bit about how it's good for the cattle to be out there grazing. It's you get the benefits of that manure, but if you're there going and doing a large application of manure, maybe you consider taking a soil test and seeing what your phosphorus levels are. Manure is very high in phosphorus, so if you have a high phosphorus amount, maybe you limit how many times you can put it on. I generally say no more than once a year anyway, but if you already have a really high phosphorus level, maybe you consider that every other year. Simply because the nutrient uptake, if phosphorus is really high, it can limit the uptake of other nutrients as well. I get a lot of questions on, corn stalks being grazed by cattle, and is there going to be any compaction issues with that? And the research that I have seen says that there's not. But I guess if you have greater concerns on that, probably a soil fertility person might be a better one to talk to. But what I have seen, that there's no issue. Let them graze it. It's good for the ground. But limit maybe manure application overall. Right now, it's also a very common time for people to be taking off in Nebraska. It's rifle deer season. And so a lot of the conflicts that happen between tenants and landowners happen because hunting is a hobby, it is a passion. So how do you manage it? Well, with cropland, you lease the cropland for 1 year. And in the cash lease, those hunting rights will actually go to the tenant. They have the right to hunt it. They have the right to sublease it out, unless you have a written lease that says you cannot sublease this, and I retain the rights to hunt. So if you like to hunt, if you like to fish on the ground, maybe there's a pond in there, make sure that you retain those rights to hunt so that you can enjoy your hobby and your passion. Again, with a pasture lease in Nebraska, those are a 5-month lease. And so typically they are done and by the 1st of November. So the prime rifle deer season, it's done by then. But if you are a bow hunter and you want to get out there early, you need to retain those rights to hunt. And it's always just a good practice to have everything in writing if you want to go out there, just because the tenant can charge you with trespassing for entering your own ground. So have it in writing. State that you don't want to sublease it out if you want to have that right to enter your ground to hunt, fish, recreational use. Get it in writing. So what should you be considering for 2025? Well, what happens to your leases? Input costs, as Jim had just showed, are high right now. And there's some uncertainty in crop prices. You know, right now we're predicted relatively the same, maybe a little bit lower for 2025. But there's also the thing to consider that most of Nebraska was in severe drought. I just looked it up today, and yes, we're getting rain now, but most of Nebraska is in severe drought, and parts of it is even in extreme drought. So how is that going to affect your land? How you can do you consider adjusting the prices? Maybe that's going to be up to you. The farm income outlook, you know, crop receipts are down this year. So maybe you need to sit down and see what, as a tenant, what you can afford to pay, and as a landowner, what your expenses are in case that tenant comes to you with a lower number. You can say yes, no, but be willing to communicate with each other. Be willing to have that communication and negotiate to what is feasible for both of you, especially if you guys have a good relationship. Good tenants, good landowners are hard to find, or hard to build up that good relationship. Maybe not hard to find, but building that relationship takes time. So be willing to negotiate with each other. For crop share leases, we are asked a lot of what's the typical lease. Maybe now's a good time to put pen and paper down and start putting out what you pay, what the total cost is. It's going to require both parties to really sit down and talk to one another, but see if what you are putting in for crop share is equitable to what you're getting out. Maybe you want to go to a flex lease. Maybe you're looking to reduce your management a little bit. Talk to your tax professional and then put the pen to paper and see if that's a more reasonable situation for you guys. So why have a written lease? Well, simply for the fact of they carry a higher value. If things do go to court or threaten it, it's not one person's word versus another. It protects the right of both parties. It protects the tenant and the landowner. And I really like to see when specific duties are written out in that lease. So a lot of times when we get some phone calls, it's someone passed away, and you know, unforeseen circumstances happen all the time. So someone passed away and they don't know if they are getting taken advantage of or they are just completely overwhelmed. So by having that written lease, it protects the tenant, it protects the landowner. You know what the rent was. You know what if they were fixing the fence. A lot of times, you know, the coffee shop talks, you hear about the high rents that the landowners are getting, but maybe you don't hear about the lower rents because they are doing some other work for the landowner, like fixing erosion, fixing fence, scooping the snow out of the driveways, that kind of thing. They don't know about that. You typically, it's like the fish stories. You only hear the really high ones. So talk to each other, have that written out so that if something does happen, you're not feeling that disgruntlement of thinking you're getting taken advantage of. If you are having a written lease, you might consider putting in there, what happens to me if I pass away? Is this contract binding on my heirs? If it's like, let's say you have a multi-year contract, is it for the duration of the contract, or is it only till the end of that crop year? You know, you might want to have that in your contract. Because you don't know what you don't know, and it's hard to understand the scope of everything that is involved in farming. So by having it written down, it really alleviates a lot of stress and tension in landlord-tenant relationships. If you are looking for a good resource to start, sorry, Jim, you came off mute. Okay. If you are needing a good resource to start out, let's say you have a verbal lease and you want to have a written lease because you want to protect yourself, you want to protect your tenant, vice versa, whichever party you are. Ag Lease 101 is a really good resource to get a lease. You know, you'll hear me say in other presentations to keep it simple. These leases are very, very thorough. So if there's stuff in there that does not pertain to you guys, you can cross it out. It's, if nothing else, it is a good starting point to have these different considerations. But you'll go ahead and click on the document library when you go to that website, and they'll bring you to this page. On the left-hand side, there are lease publications. I want you to remember the fact that these are fairly, they're getting a little bit older. Some are 10 years, some are a little bit newer, but consider what that year was, and maybe you adjust the price accordingly. When I'm asked, you know, what do I charge for my dry lot? This is where I go, because Nebraska and other states, you know, we just don't have the capacity to do that in-depth research. So this is where we go. So you can see that kind of information there. But then on the right-hand side, we have different lease forms, and we have it, they have it broken down into cash farm lease, a crop share, they have pasture leases, they have facility leases. So they have everything there. You can download it. If you want to create your own, great. If you want to just use this and fill it out and maybe you save it onto your computer, update it year to year, great. Whatever you want to do. So now we'll go into Ask an Expert. Jim, I'll just continue sharing.
All right, sounds good. So I think I'll take the first question and then you can take the second one, Anastasia. All right. All right, let's hear. Maybe it's the first two questions. Question we had asked to us, what is the most common type of insurance that people are taking for our crops? Well, I was able to pull an update from a report from the USDA, the Economic Research Service. They take a look at different types of trends occurring in the ag industry. And the majority of policies sold in the United States, as well as the state of Nebraska, majority of them either individual or individual revenue or yield, which is that pink and kind of light green color. One policy type that might be growing to some extent is that area-wide program. There are some different types of area-wide insurances that are supplements or stacking on top of the individual revenue. But I would say the majority of things that I'm aware of, at least in eastern Nebraska, tend to be somewhere between 65, 70, 75, or 80, probably 70 and 75 are the most common type of revenue protection crop insurance. So that's that slide right there. And you'll notice that how much we're insuring has increased in recent years because of our liability. The higher the value of the crop, the higher the commodity price, the more that we're going to be able to insure. If commodity prices decline a little bit, well, then that's going to be a reflection. The big take home that I've seen in this slide right here is go back 10, 15, 20 years ago. The advent of crop insurance with revenue protection really kind of took off in the mid to late 2000s. And then the first large indemnity payments was when it got so dry in that 2012, and here we are again. So, all right, let's go to the next slide, Anastasia. And one other question I'll take, where are land prices and cash rental rates headed in the future? Could land prices drop or level off along with rents? Well, I'm sure many folks have seen this slide, and you may have not seen this update recently, but we have two things on this slide. First thing that we have in the red is the marketing your average price of corn. You could use the price of soybeans, wheat, any other major commodity raised in the state. But I'm just kind of using this as a rough index to show the profitability. Clearly, we're at a higher price now than we were, say, a decade ago, but we have come off some of the recent highs that we set in the last, let's say, the last 2 years. And you'll notice when you go back, if you are looking at that chart right there, that when corn prices dropped the first time, we didn't see land values dropping off overnight. We did see some moderation over time. And we like to see gradual changes over time. Anytime you have a sharp increase up, down, or anywhere in between, that's when you start seeing some issues arise. So we're seeing a gradual change up or down or somewhere in between here in 25. I think we'll probably be seeing some degree of moderation. We already seen between 23 and 24, you'll notice that that percent change was much smaller than it was the prior years. The other major thing on the next slide here is the interest rates, cost of borrowing. I think interest rates have maybe backed down a little bit, but they're clearly much higher now, the cost of borrowing money. And you know, if you're dealing with a beginning producer and you want all your cash rent up front day one when the lease is signed, I always tell people to be careful, especially if you're dealing with someone with limited capital, someone with not a lot of money that's having to borrow the money, because the cash rent's actually about, say, 8 to 10% higher than what you're charging if you have to carry that money that's being borrowed on the interest for 10 months or so. So interest rates are something that weighs down on real estate, whether asset values or potentially cash rents as well, unless additional profitability offsets it. So things I'd keep in mind is, where are the future prices going over the next year? Anastasia kind of indicated roughly where she anticipates, you know, somewhat similar to where we ended this season. And interest rates, they might back off just a little bit, but I don't know if we're going to see a huge decline overnight. We might get back to something more commonly that we've seen on the interest rate level, say something that was common between about 2013 and 2018 or 2019, maybe. I don't know. But those are the two things to keep an eye on. So watch your local real estate market, local real estate sales, and keep an eye out for any news releases from the University of Nebraska or the USDA or whoever you get your information from on real estate markets. So if you want to go to the next slide, Anastasia, I think this is your question.
Yep. So what provisions need to be in a verbal lease, a termination letter? Well, you have to have a couple different things. You have to have the date. You have to have the addresses for both parties, the landlord and the tenant. You need the legal description of the property and the term stating the termination of the lease. So when are you terminating it? This is going to be depending on whether or not you have a written contract or you have a verbal lease. If you have a verbal lease, remember, you need that 6 months prior to March 1 notice. So you're a little bit too late to terminate for the 2025 growing season. But if you have a written lease that says that you just need to terminate by, let's say, January 1 or a different date with so much notice, that's going to be laid out. But the terms need to be stated in that termination letter. You might consider consulting with an attorney to send it out, just to make sure all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. It's a nominal fee, and we do recommend that you send a certified mail with a return receipt so that you can say with certainty that they did pick this up, they did receive it, so that, you have that confirmation as well in case they wanted to fight it. Nebraska Extension does not provide any sample termination letters, but these are good things, what to include in a termination letter, what we have listed here.
Very good. I think there might be a few more yet here, Anastasia.
Oh, sorry. If the ground will be sold and the current lease ends on February 28th, 2025, does notification need to be given to the tenant on lease termination? Well, we always encourage professional courtesy be shown to one party or to another. So notify it sooner than later. And it simply comes down to, what does the lease say? Does the lease end or does it have a rollover clause? And with a rollover clause, if you have a piece of paper that you just sign every single year, I want to point out that unless you have the termination lined out in that lease, that becomes kind of a worthless piece of paper. And because if it doesn't have how termination will be given, it reverts back to verbal lease law. So a verbal lease, again, it has to be notified prior to September 1 of 2024. So it kind of depends. Do you have a verbal lease or a written lease? If you have a verbal lease, it carries over. If it's a written lease, depending on what you have in there. Some tenants will just turn it over, some will not. And that's something that you and your other party need to discuss. So it depends. I don't have a good answer here because it depends on your situation.
Good. All right, I think we had one question here. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. On cash or bushel rent on pivot irrigated ground, how are the pivot expenses usually paid? How much to the landlord and how much to the tenant? Let me try to answer this one. So if you have a situation, either a cash lease or a bushel rent, which is a form of a cash lease, and you have a landlord and a tenant, what expenses does the landlord pay for? What expenses does the tenant pay for? Well, if it's truly a cash lease, the tenant would be paying for the energy, diesel, electricity, natural gas, propane, whatever you're pumping the water with. And also, it's not uncommon to see a provision in the lease where the first 500 to maybe 1,000 or so in expenses on what we call the consumable components, maybe a few nozzles need to be replaced, maybe you need to fix a flat tire. It's not uncommon to see have a provision in the lease that the tenant covers that. Anything in excess of whatever the agreed upon amount is. Something major goes wrong with the pivot. Say, for example, the well collapses and you have to drill a new well in the middle of the growing season. That's a landlord expense. That's a major component. Assuming that the tenant is not negligible, meaning they didn't drive a large piece of equipment into the side of the pivot or something, and they are using it appropriately, the landlord would be the one responsible for that. Do you have anything to add to that, Anastasia?
I guess I would just add to that. Make sure that you are communicating with them, like what happens if that pivot goes down, 4th of July weekend, everything is closed. What happens then? Who covers that expense? Or just be willing to communicate with each other then, because if it's a really dry year, do you let it burn up? It's just something that, tensions could be created in that type of situation. So, just have that communication, put it in a lease up to so much amount is covered. That's what I would add. And I can take the next question. What is a common percentage split on a crop share lease in Nebraska? Well, it depends on where you live. We'll start off with the western side, we see more 70-30s there. And then as you work your way east, the percentages start to change a little bit higher to the landowner. So, and eastern Nebraska, we do see some 50-50s. That's more so some irrigated ground, some really high productive ground. We see a lot of 60-40s kind of in depending on where you live. But I think it kind of, where that risk is on the eastern side, there's less risk because we get more rain. So you're going to see those higher percentages. On the western side, it's more risky. So therefore we see a lot more of those 70-30 splits. I know like in the southeastern Nebraska, I see a lot of 60-40s on dry land. I see some 50-50s on irrigated land. I'll let Jim kind of answer what he sees a lot of.
This is a good question we maybe should do on some of our survey work we do here. I would agree with Anastasia. The big thing is, what is the norms of the area? And I don't have a good definition. I would agree that they definitely change depending on the greater eastern or western half. All right, and we're going to go through the next couple of slides here. I wanted to remind those of you that are still on our call today, if you want to go forward, Anastasia.
Yep.
That's just a reminder about sponsorship. If anyone has a reminder, any business, any real estate brokerage company, whatever that's joining us, just contact Anastasia or myself and get you set up with that. I'm going to go to the next slide. We have a series of meetings coming up. Skip this, skip the next one, go to this one. There we go. All right. We have our annual landlord-tenant cash rent meeting series. The meetings that we've had scheduled so far for November, it actually kicks off today. So if you can get to the North Platte Extension office here in a few minutes, you can go sit in on this meeting if it's going on. We also have Kearney tomorrow, and then in the eastern part of the state, we'll have York and Alliance, or I guess Alliance is out west as well. We'll have York and eastern Nebraska with Anastasia and myself helping out with that one. And Shannon Sand and Jessica Grosskopf will be coordinating the other sites in the greater western half of the state. Proceed to the next slide here. We also have some meetings in the eastern part in Norfolk and also in Sydney as well, Meade, O'Neill. And then on the next slide, we also have Wilbur and Dakota City planned. So if you'd like to attend any of these meetings, all you have to do is just call the local county extension office. The only reason we're asking for registration is if the meeting is over the noon hour, we'll have a meal to go with it. So we need an accurate count for that. And also if there's a blizzard or something pop up, we will reschedule things accordingly. And with that being said, we just want to make sure we have the correct contact info to get a hold of folks, probably just a phone number. And we also have Land Management Quarterly on February 17th. Kick off the first series. I need to change the date on that. I believe it's the 17th, but it'll be 2025. So I'll get this corrected before we post the slides. And yeah, we have kind of an update on some of the trends in leases, cash rents. What do we need to be looking at? And submit your questions, either email them to us directly or through the Land Management Quarterly website, and we will get them posted. Make up some good slides. So with that, I think we got all the questions answered. You'll notice in the chat, Ryan Evans also sent out the little cap.unl.edu/land25. That's the most comprehensive listing, and Anastasia and myself will be doing, I don't know, we'll probably add another 5 to 7 meetings after the first year between now and the middle of March. So keep an eye out. And if you're in an area where we haven't been in a while, give us a call and maybe we can get one planned if you can get a group of people together. So, and that series of meetings is a very popular one. We have kind of a Q&A at the end of it, but we comprised a series of questions that people have asked us over the years. And I think they'll be very interesting for those in attendance to get those reviewed. So with that, do you have anything else to add, Anastasia?
I do not.
All right, I don't. We can stay on another minute here. Everyone's pretty well stuck with us. A few people have dropped off. We answered all the questions that were in the Q&A. We addressed those in the chat as well. And I'll get that day updated there and send these slides over to Ryan Evans, and he'll work on getting these. This should be February 17th. I gotta double check that on my calendar. I believe that is 17th. Yeah, that is the Monday. It's President's Day. But we'll go ahead and have this meeting anyways on that day. That's not a big deal for us. So, all right, unless you have something else you'd like to add, thanks for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in the new year. Bye, everyone.